I'm Steph.
And I'm Jeff. Each week, we review a film that's streaming on Netflix or Amazon Prime.
As writers, we'll deep dive into the hook, plot, characters, and ending to tell you if it's a good story.
Listen at your own risk. This review contains spoilers.
Now sit back,
relax,
and enjoy Stream On. Today, we'll be reviewing The Runaways, streaming right now on Netflix.
Joan, Jett, and Cherie Currie are teens living in 1970s LA. Each is looking for a way out of their aimless lives, seeking fame in the music industry. With a few like-minded young women and the help of sleazy but savvy producer Kim Fowley, they find success as the Runaways. However, they learn that fame always comes with a price.
The Runaways was directed by Floria Sigismondi and also written by Floria. It's based on the book Neon Angel, a memoir of a runaway by Cherie Currie, who was the lead singer in the 1970s rock band The Runaways. It stars Dakota Fanning as Cherie Currie, Kristen Stewart as Joan Jett, who is the lead guitarist and really the talent behind The Runaways, Michael Shannon as Kim Fowley, the sleazy record producer, and Riley Keough, which, side note, she is Elvis's granddaughter, as Marie Currie, who is the twin sister to Cherie Currie. So, Jeff, why did you pick this movie?
I like movies about the creative process. It can be in the context of the music industry, film industry, literature, art. Doesn't really matter. All of that is just interesting to me. And as a creative person myself, I find a bit of simpatico with the kind of stories that people tell about other creatives. I also just happen to have a soft spot for some reason for music industry films in particular. They can be fictional movies like This is Spinal Tap, Velvet Goldmine, or American Pop, or nonfiction. Sound City is one I just saw. One of my favorite films to rewatch is The Kids Are Alright, a great Who documentary. I think the reason I find music films so fascinating is that it is one of the creative endeavors that I have a very hard time with. I'm a good writer, pretty good with some of the other arts, decent filmmaker. My musical skills are minimal. It's kind of a glimpse into a creative process that I have a hard time with. Now with this movie, the subject was one of the big draws. I love The Runaways. Great band. Definitely in my playlist, And quite frankly, the 70s feel, that kind of nostalgia works for me. That's really kind of a throwback to my childhood, so it was fun seeing some of the fashions and things like that, even if I was a bit too young to participate in some of the hedonism we see, unfortunately. So, yeah, there you go. That's why I picked this.
Okay, well, let's jump into what this film reminds us of. I chose the TV series Glow, which is also a Netflix series. And Glow is about women that are trying to get into wrestling in the 1980s. And so the parallels for me were a couple of things. One, it's a period piece and it really immerses you in the culture of the time. Glow is obviously 1980s versus The Runaways is 1970s. But you really feel like you're back in that time period. The second parallel to me is that it's about women trying to carve their path in what is historically a male-dominated profession. So in Glow, you have wrestling, and in The Runaways, you have electric guitar and rock and roll, and The Runaways trying to be the first all-girl rock and roll band. It also features an eccentric male coach character, and Glow has that same type of eccentric male coach character that, is a bit opportunistic. I mean, I think with The Runaways, the coach character is a lot worse than the one in Glow, which we'll get into. If you liked the feel of Glow in that TV series, I think you will like The Runaways. What about you, Jeff?
I picked Sid and Nancy, thematically very similar. You have another fictionalized account of a real-world band, in that case, the Sex Pistols, with a very similar theme of these working class kids getting into the music industries. And then it really dives into also the perils of making it big. It also takes place right around the same time and takes these real world plot points and characters, but then puts them into the very dramatized narrative structure.
So, Jeff, what are your thoughts on The Hook? Did it set up the story well and grab you in the first 15 minutes?
It did. In The Hook, we are introduced to the three main characters, Joan Jett, Cherie Currie, and Kim Fowley. With Joan and Cherie, we get a bit more character development, but that makes sense because they really are the main characters. We get a chance to see that Joan is far more of a creative person than Cherie. Cherie is more of a performer. Her introduction really takes place during this talent contest in her high school, where she lip syncs adequately to a David Bowie song. Joan is definitely shown as someone who has more talent, or at least she is driven to be more creative, to actually create something new. Fowley's introduction is purely as an operator, right? He's the producer. He's the guy who knows the people to talk to and knows the industry enough that he can get the Runaways onto a stage, into a recording studio. He can turn that kind of raw talent and desire into reality. It's interesting that with both Joan and Cherie, when they're introduced, they're actually modeling male imagery as an attempt to get out of the roles that 70s America would prescribe for them. Joe's introduction is in a clothing store, and when the woman at the counter asks what she wants, she points to this dude in a leather coat that she's talking to, and it's like, I want to look like him. Cherry's introduction is when she's making herself up to look like David Bowie. Joan goes for a very kind of hyper masculine look, whereas Cherry is modeling a rock star who was known for being very androgynous at that time. So I have a bit more to say about this, but did you have any thoughts about that stuff in particular? And did you think that the introduction of those two characters worked?
Yeah, so for Cherie, I thought the introduction was fine. It really set her up to be a performer, like you mentioned, that she was focused on image and mimicking what was considered popular, even if it was like counterculture popular at the time. Also, with her character, I liked how it showed some of the family dynamics at play. So the Hook set up her relationship with her twin sister, and just that you could tell that they had some sibling rivalry, like normal stuff, but also that they were really supportive of one another and there for each other and had a bond. I thought that was just well acted throughout the whole film. And it set up the absent father that, it was Cherie's birthday and the dad wasn't there. And she like called him and he was too busy for her. So she's sitting there alone with her cake that she had made. I mean, the mom wasn't around either. I mean, it really showed how absent her parents were. And actually, that's a question I had from multiple characters. Like, where are the parents of these teenagers? They're like running around doing a whole bunch of stuff in like the clubs at night. You've got the creepy producer Kim Fowley like trolling around in underage clubs looking for talent. I'm like, where are these kids' parents? But it did a good job setting up the absent family that Cherie had that, we'll see contributes later on to what happens to her as a character. So felt it worked for Cherie. For Joan, there's some issues I had with how they set up Joan. So one thing is I felt they hit us over the head a bit with the girls can be just like boys theme. I felt that Kristen Stewart overacted it in The Hook in terms of that, with between the scene at the clothing store, the on top of Old Smoky scene where basically she's trying to learn to play guitar. She has an instructor and he's trying to get her to do acoustic guitar and do it on top of Old Smoky, and she wants to do electric guitar, and it just felt it just felt over the top.
Just one thing though, Joan Jett has said that scene is basically what happened.
Yeah, but I think it's just how it was acted for me. And then I think the other thing is that early on in the first 15 minutes, they go into Joan Jett's sexuality. So Joan Jett has never been public about her sexuality, although people, have guessed that she's bi, queer, somewhere in that spectrum, but she has never said that. And they right away hit you in the very beginning as they're introducing you to Joan. That she's like playing guitar with a friend and they kiss each other, and you get early on that is a thing, and I just don't think you needed that in the first 15 minutes. I think it was enough to introduce Joan as a talented creative. Yeah, she's a little edgy and trying to be like the boys. You don't need to hit us over the head with it, like this film I feel did. And let us ease into the bi queer stuff. There's a scene later on with her and Cherie where you could have introduced it then in a more organic way than you did at the beginning of this film. And so I just didn't like her introduction. She's such a unique talent, and I just felt it was overacted and it was too much in the first 15 minutes for me. And then Kim Fowley is Kim Fowley. I mean, they do a decent job with him as just sort of the creepy producer. In the first 15 minutes, you get that sense.
For me, the hook ends with the creation of the song Cherry Bomb. So that takes place about 17 minutes into the movie. And by that time, all of our principals have met. The Runaways have formed. They haven't played a gig yet, but they're practicing in this abandoned trailer. There's a great scene where Kim and Joan are creating a song, and it turns out to be Cherry Bomb, which is a song they're going to have Currie sing. I thought that was a great little condensation of how the creative process works, from a basic dissatisfaction or a basic idea, and then how creative people collaborate to make something interesting, and then are able to turn it over to a performer to actually perform it. For me, that was like the end of the hook and a great way to end it.
Yeah, that was a great scene. I will agree. That's one of the best scenes in the whole film. Is the cherry bomb. Like it was catchy. It was a good organic how we're creating a song, and it really got you excited about the band. So I would agree with you on that scene. What are your thoughts about how Joan Jett's character was in the first 15 minutes? Did you have any issues with how it was introduced, or did that work for you?
The only part that I had an issue with was something you mentioned, was the guitar lesson scene. And as I said, Joan Jett said that essentially did happen. Okay. But the on the nose way the guitar teacher says, what is it? Girls don't play rock and roll. It is hammering this theme home. And it does lead to an interesting question about when you're taking real events, but putting them in a at least semi-fictionalized context, even if it's something is true, it may not work. And in this case, I actually agree with you on this part. That scene didn't work because it seemed like they're just bashing you over the head with this idea. And you didn't really need that.
Well, and as a writer, if I wanted to keep that real world scene in because, it did happen per Joan, I would have maybe not had the scene at the clothing store where she's trying to, buy the male clothes. I would have taken out the queer kissing scene and just let that grow later on with her and Cherie. And I think that scene could have worked if you didn't have the other scenes hitting you over the head with it along the way.
The rest of the introduction worked for me, though. I thought that the whole idea of our two female leads being introduced modeling men is an interesting comment on culture at that time. We get a little bit of that even with Ken Fowley, though, because when we're introduced to him, he has like some of that like a little bit of glam rock makeup on, but it is kind of getting into that idea that the 70s was this time of experimentation and decadence. Well, at least that worked for me. As far as the kissing scene you mentioned, the way I looked at it was not so much a commentary on Joan being bi. It was to show her aggressiveness. She just takes the initiative and does that, right? And that's what worked for that scene for me, is that when we're introduced to her and in that opening 10-15 minutes, we really get the idea that she is the driving force behind a lot of this. She's the one who's really pushing this idea of the Runaways, an all-girl band. She's the one who approaches Kim Fowley. She actually is the one who helps recruit Cherie and does like all the initial practice sessions with the band and is kind of leading all that. And again, with the scene that ends the hook, it is her and Kim Fowley creating this new song. So I think that all worked to kind of set her up as this driving force. So yeah, that worked for me. So I agree with you that the on top of Old Smoky scene just did not work very well. The other thing that was a little overdone were the gender politics as they were introduced. Basically, every guy in this movie is either a scumbag, abusive, or absent. And many of them are all of those. And it was so overdone. I mean, the scene that we both liked, which was Cherie at the talent contest, right? Every guy in the audience winds up throwing stuff at her while all the women are cheering her. And that was something that becomes a problem as the movie goes on, is that it's not subtle.
Right. The movie is not subtle about the points it's trying to make. And it's that classic thing as a writer where you want to show, not tell. And there was too much telling from with me, Joan Jett's character, with you, the gender politics. Like, yeah. And you could feel that in the hook, and that tone carries through the movie. One thing I did like about the hook is I thought it did a good job immersing you in the music scene of LA in the mid 70s. Like, I really did feel like I was there. They chose good music. Like, they did the Susie Quattro song Wild One. They did David Bowie, Lady Grinning Soul. Like, it that was good. I think to set up a period movie like this, you really do need to get the nostalgia right, and they did.
I agree. And actually, Joan Jett agrees as well. Dug up this interview right after the film's release, and she was actually asked about how well the film captures the decade, and her response was, "Yeah, I think it does. Actually, that music, that sort of combination of glam and intensity, it was decadent. It was also very attractive." And I think that really does come through.
I was not born yet, but if I was in the 70s at all, I feel like that's what it would have been like as a teenager in LA in the mid 70s.
So, is there anything else the hook you wanted to bring up?
Let's dive into the plot. I think that covered my main points in the hook.
So, overall, I think we both think the hook in general works. And I think as a viewer, you're going to be like, okay, I know who these people are, even if some of the stuff is a little clunky. And
Yeah, in general, it works.
so, Steph, what did you think about the plot?
So, in terms of the character dynamics in the plot, there are a couple of things that I wanted to hit on as a writer. So, the first is Cherie's family dynamics. I thought this was one of the better writing elements that of the film that the screenwriter did in adapting this memoir into film is focusing on her family because it sets up why Cherie is so susceptible to the fame getting to her and going down a destructive path because she really didn't have a strong sense of who she was and where she came from. So she's got this bond with her sister, and that's very well acted between Dakota and Riley. Her sister was probably the thing that meant the most to her in her life was the relationship she had with her, because she had a very narcissistic mom and she had an alcoholic deadbeat dad. And you see multiple scenes that show how fragile the family system is. So one scene early on, the mom shows up and she's like, "We're moving to Indonesia." It's her and her boyfriend, and the mom just up and decides that that's what she's going to do, is move to Indonesia with her boyfriend, and that Cherie and her sister are basically can go live with the dad and an aunt. Then you see another scene where Cherie is about to go on the road with the band, and she encounters her dad, who's in the car passed out drunk. And she's like not sure what to do. The band is waiting for her, and her sister Marie comes out and says, "I've got this. You go and you do your dream with the band, and I will take care of dad." And it's this beautiful moment between them where this Marie recognizes that Cherie has an opportunity to get out of this terrible family system, and that this is like her ticket out, and that the sister's kind of gonna be back helping out at home and keeping the home front together while Cherie is going off. But the sister also hopes, if you're able to make it, hopefully I can get out of this terrible home life as well. And unfortunately, Cherie doesn't really deliver on that promise. There's another poignant moment where Cherie's about to go like to Japan on tour, and Marie's like, "Oh, I'm so excited." And she's like talking about what she can do to help out. And Cherie's like, "You can't come." And it's just it's this sad moment where, the sister has been so like faithful and supporting Cherie and keeping things patched together at home, and Cherie's just kind of leaving her sister behind. So yeah, I just thought the dynamics there were really well done, and it added depth to Cherie's character and what happens to her.
The sisters, their relationship is actually the most non archetypical one in this movie. Every other character, or I should say, every other prominent character, fits a specific kind of archetype that fits within a perils of frame narrative structure. You have Joan as that kind of driven, creative person who wants to change the world. Cherie is the performer who wants adulation and fame, but is kind of along for the ride and gets drawn into the darker parts of fame. Kim is that the guy who's going to organize everything, give you that call to adventure, the one who's going to open the doors for you, and then becomes very Svengali like, right? Where he's just manipulating them and a terrible human. But all these are fairly archetypical. Cherie and Marie, their relationship strikes me as more real. And it does serve to humanize Cherie. It's like she has something beyond just the band. Not much, but she does have something because we never see Joan's home life.
Because the story is told from the memoir written by Cherie, we really get much more inside what's going on in Cherie's world than Joan's.
Yes, definitely. And the other band members are barely there. There's Lita Ford, Sandy West, their characters in the movie, but they have very little to do. Sandy, the drummer, has a few lines and is important in a few scenes, but mostly is just background. Robin isn't even a real person. She was concocted for this movie. It had to do with the actual bass player, Jacqueline Fuchs, who didn't want to let them use her name. But all these characters are basically just window dressing for the mains.
Yeah, I mean the sisterhood relationship feels authentic, and they say a lot in these just in these scenes that there's emotion there, but they're not over the top. It's like subtle stuff. Like Cherie comes back from Japan, and she gives her sister this cool like handbag that she got for her, and it's meaningful because it's like it's bejeweled with their names on it. And Marie watches Cherie as, she's seen her dad that's dying, and Cherie steals her dad's pills. And Marie looks and sees that with disapproving eyes, but also understanding eyes, because she can see how her sister is like not handling fame well. Um, and the jealousy that she once had for her sister kind of fades more into pity as the movie goes on.
Do you feel that having point of view characters, in particular Joan and Fowley, not be given that kind of authenticity building scenes is a problem with this movie?
Yes. Yes, it is a problem with this movie. I don't think they did enough with Joan's character. And I don't think they did Kim Foley's character well. I have a lot to say actually about Kim Foley's character.
And so do I. But I do want to just go a little bit deeper into what we just said here. When you're adapting non-fictional setting to, fictional structure, and, as far as I know, the actual trajectory of the band was basically what we saw on the screen, but it also follows a lot of the structure and tropes of the perils of fame story type. How do you fictionalize real events? And it's not an easy thing for an author or a filmmaker or any sort of creative person who's taking real people and putting them into a semi fictionalized or completely fictionalized setting. What decisions do you make about what to keep in and what to leave out? Because you mentioned that a lot of this is based on Currie's book, but clearly not everything was. I mean, she's not the only point of view character. Whenever you decide to use a real person in a fictional or semi fictional setting, those choices you make about what to leave in and what to leave out uh, are always fascinating to me.
Hmm.
And in this case, it's like, why just do the more humanizing moments with Currie and not with Joan Jett? So, what do you think? Would it have helped? Would it have not helped? Would it have just taken up more time?
There is only so much screen time to go into a character and who they are. And the film did focus mainly on Cherie. It did feel like Joan Jett's story was very secondary to Cherie's, and then they rushed it at the end. It would have been nice to see her story fleshed out, but in order to do that, you would have had to cut down certain scenes, like some of the scenes where they're performing. You would have had to maybe to shorten that so that you had more moments to be able to really get Joan's perspective on things. Because Joan is always very reactionary to what's happening with Cherie. It's a shame that you didn't get enough of Joan's story in this, but I think that's just because the material came from Cherie's point of view.
Okay. And I'm not even saying that would have been necessary. It was just one of those things when you see an imbalance in how the point of view characters are sketched out, how they're developed, how you see, both their primary and kind of secondary relationships. It's always one of the things you're like, well, why was this done? And I think your explanation is probably the right one. Is just that this is most of this was adapted from Currie's book, so a greater weight was given to her, private life than the other character.
I think the most frustrating adaptation of a real life character for me was not Joan, but Kim Fowley. And I do want to speak on this because what they did with Kim's character is this. So in the film, he's portrayed as comedic, over the top. He is focused on making this band successful. There's these like visceral moments where he's trying to get the band to perform and to really like pull it there. sexual energy, their creative energy, all of that. And there is a moment, but they really dumb it down where he's like pretending to be a heckler, and he's like throwing things at them. But they make it more comedic than what it was. So in reality, Kim Fowley has been accused of rape. In particular, was accused of raping Jackie Fuchs, the bass player. Possibly one reason she didn't want her actual name used in this film, because of how they were portraying her alleged rapist, right? When she was underage. He exploited the band, paid them very little, worked them like too hard with no rest. He was described as verbally and physically abusive. Like he threw things at them and hurt them. Not like they made the scene more comedic than what it is in real life. Cherie ended up getting pregnant at one point as a teenager while on tour, I think like overseas, by not Kim Fowley, but another manager, that and ended up having an abortion. I mean, there's just like all this dark stuff that happened that was completely glossed over in the film. And so by the point we get to Cherie's breakdown, like it we don't really get like a good sense of why she broke down. There's like so many deeper things that happened. So I just felt that was a misstep. I think the writer, with the screenwriting and adaptations, they should have gone darker with his character. Personally, I would have been more interested in that.
You would prefer the Runaways if it was about Kim Fowley raping Fuchs and the aftermath of that.
Not just that, but just his exploitation of this band and how it led to the dissolution of the band.
Well, what I would say is, according to the band members, though, that was part of it. Some of it was just that they didn't particularly get along.
Right, but my understanding is some of the reason they didn't get along is because he didn't help with camaraderie between them. He kind of pitted them against each other.
Well, I think we get that idea that he sees them as a commodity. I don't think that's hidden by the film. I think that is a theme. I guess when we're talking about someone like Fowley, right? It does get to an interesting question when you're including real people in your work of, in this case, semi-fiction. How much do you sanitize them? And it's what story you're trying to tell. Now, clearly, the maker of The Runaway, what they wanted to tell was a kind of standard Perils of Fame story. With Fowley, clearly what they wanted him as was, and you're right, this kind of dark comic relief. Like, it's clear in the movie that he exploits them, but I agree. There's nothing about him being a sexual predator. But I'd say that's clearly not the story that these people want to tell. Because then that gets into, and that could be an interesting movie, don't get me wrong. Because then it gets into this thing that, okay, Fowley assaults Fuchs, and then Fuchs plays with the band for 2 more years. And then you have both Currie and Joan Jett have been kind of fuzzy about what happened. So you have to play into that as like, and that could be a very interesting movie about when you take the young, ambitious women and put them into a situation like that, where there is a person with power, right? The person who has the connections is going to make them a band. What are those sort of, what do you put up with? What are
Mm-hmm.
the compromise you have to make? That there is a fascinating movie. Clearly, though, that is not what this is about.
Yeah, it's not the direction they chose to go with this film. And I personally think it would have been a more interesting, better film. I mean, this felt very paint by numbers in terms of like, okay, put the band together, they rise to fame. Let's watch them rise to fame. We see them doing drugs, getting lost in the lifestyle of partying and fame, and then someone has a breakdown, the end. Presenting the real, raw version of what happened to this band for me would have been more interesting and where I would have gone if I was writing to adapt this to film.
In your writing, do you ever introduce real people into your fiction? Because I do on occasion. Have you ever done that? Or are all your characters in your various works just fictional?
No, I mainly stick with fictional characters, but they might be inspired by a real person.
From my experience, when you're introducing a real person into a fictional context, you have to choose what things you actually want to talk about. What's their point? And often it's their point is how they propel your narrative forward. If you made this about Kim Fowley Predator, well, that becomes the entire story, or that becomes such a huge chunk of the story that really is not about Joan, Jett, and Cherie Currie, these two teenagers who rapidly rise to the top of the rock scene, and then the whole thing falls apart. Fowley's character is there basically to give them entree and to give them their or his own version of wisdom about how to succeed in the rock industry in the 70s as a group of teenage women. I mean, you had mentioned the scene where he has a couple of like kids come in and throw stuff at them to show them how to handle hecklers. Well, we see in the immediate next scene where they're playing their first gig, a house party, that that training, if you will, immediately comes in handy. So it's not him being abusive, it is him teaching them how to survive in this new world they're traveling in. And I'm not saying that the historical character wasn't abusive. What I'm saying, though, is that they clearly had a highly sanitized and fictional version of Fowley because of the role he had to play in the story.
Right. It's the story they chose to tell, but it's I mean, this is also a story of Cherie and what happened to her and what led to her breakdown, right? That's like the culminating moment of the film where she breaks down and then unravels. And I just didn't get to the breakdown felt inauthentic and it just happened very quickly on film. Oh, the fame's getting to her. It's cliched, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. If you're going to show her break down so badly to the point where she starts verbally assaulting a checkout clerk in a grocery store, then you need more to get me there than the fame got to her.
So while the breakdown she eventually has seems fairly stereotypical, as you said, sex and drugs, alcohol, get through there. It does fit with the perils of fame narrative structure that the filmmakers decide to hang the story on. So instead of getting deeper into the effects of Kim Fowley's abuse or deep into the you know interpersonal dynamics of the band, it really goes much more into the you're famous, you're young, you have all this access to drugs and booze and roadies throwing themselves at you, and you just can't handle that. And so then you fall apart. It's an example of using these tropes of fiction in a nonfiction film or a nonfiction story.
Mm-hmm.
When you're doing a quote unquote true story, is it really a true story? Or is it just a collection of real people and some real events that you tie together with all the normal tropes of fiction to make it more interesting?
Right. I mean, to me, this is a sanitized, fictionalized version of what really happened to this band. And the more, for me, the more interesting story is what really happened to this band. And yes, it's a darker story to tell. It changes the tone of the movie completely. I agree with you on that. This is sort of a lighter, classic follow the tropes of, fame getting to you story, versus darker, more complex story to tell, but I would have preferred the truer story that is a little darker and more complex. I think it would have made it a more interesting film for me because I've seen this film before, right? This type, I've seen this. This is a very tired, worn out plot.
The only thing I differ with you on that is I personally think it's a tired, worn out plot. It's a standard plot. There's nothing wrong with doing a Perils of Fame story. There are lots of them out there that can be very effective. I think the crux of your criticism is that there is a potentially more interesting story that the filmmakers, if they want to take some chances, could have told.
Exactly. Yeah. So, do you have anything else, Jeff, about the plot that you wanted to bring up?
The only thing I really want to get into, and what I have as my primary problem with this film, is how it portrays gender politics. And it's not a problem of having gender politics as a core theme. And it's not even the idea of, you know, all your primary characters or your two primary characters are women, and you're going to show how difficult it was to function in a very male centered world. My problem is what I like to call the hammer versus the feather. This movie hammers home out every single person who happens to be male is a jerk, exploitation, missing, or just background. There is no balance in with any of the men.
Yeah, I agree. They don't really show a positive male figure throughout this entire film.
And that's okay, but this is where the feather part comes in. It's so cartoonishly done. So the scene I'm thinking of is on their first road trip. It's with Joan and Sandy West's a drummer, and they're basically doing a sound check. And two guys come in who I believe are supposed to be members of the band that they're opening for. They are very aggressive towards them. They're threatening them, they're belittling them, and it comes out of nowhere. But not only comes out of nowhere, it is so over the top that whether it really happened or not, it seems like a cliche. And there's a lot of stuff like that. Currie's father is basically a drunken ghost until he dies.
Hmm.
If a little bit of time had been put into giving the any of the male characters some layering, and you don't have to make them good guys or even really or positive or anything like that, but make them less caricatures.
I mean, you had the on the road manager who seemed like he could be like a somewhat decent guy, although he ends up having sex with Cherie, and I think he's an adult and she's not. But you could have added more depth to him, perhaps, or even to Cherie's relationship with her dad. But yeah, no, the film really made all men seem like terrible human beings. Even with Kim Fowley being more dark and comedic, he still was exploitive. The film does show that. Women, hear them roar. Men, terrible monsters. It did hit you over the head. I agree. A lot of hammer, not any feather.
Well, and I'm going to briefly reference the series that this reminds you of, Glow. Glow handles those or that theme, the idea of gender politics and women getting into a predominantly male field and all that, with a lot more subtlety, and a lot more thought, and a lot more care.
Mm-hmm.
And it actually makes that message more impactful, more realistic. So it makes the theme that you're pushing seem more of a valid critique than just some sloganeering you're doing to get people to watch. I know that's not very elegant, but Glow does a much better job of the same thing.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, Glow is also a series, so they have more time to really explore gender politics. It's versus a film. You got to really be more selective with how you use your screen time. But I think that one scene that you mentioned with Joan and Sandy and the two random guys that are criticizing them and being awful to them, like, and you could have cut out that whole scene. It didn't add any value to the film. Okay, well, let's go to the ending, Jeff. So, what were your thoughts about how they wrapped up this film?
So the final scene has Joan, who has continued in her musical career, being interviewed on a, I guess, Los Angeles radio station. Cherie is working in a retail establishment. She calls into the show. They have a what I think is a very nice moment, and it's not over the top. Which for a film that does a lot of things over the top, I thought that last scene was well done and fairly subtle. The ending worked really well. That was a nice way to see how these characters had ended up after that shared dream they had kind of fell apart. What did you think about that? Did that work for you?
So that one scene worked for me, where yeah, she's calls into the radio station, and there's this like moment between them where they don't have to say a lot, but you can tell a lot's being said between them, even with few words. So yeah, and I think it's "She Hears I Love Rock and Roll" is the song, which is one of Joan Jett's best. And so, and you can in that moment you can tell that Joan is really the talent. What I didn't like about the ending is, they kind of do this rushed Joan Jett rise to fame, um, which I don't even think you needed to see. I think you could have just had like the Cherie Joan moment. I don't think we needed to see any of like Joan Jett in the bathtub working on a song and that kind of thing, because it's not the Joan Jett story. The other thing that didn't work for me about the end is that it really misses the mark on Cherie's growth. So, the real story, because I did, of course, research on like the real story. And, yeah, she was an addict. She was a washed up star at one point, and her 15 minutes have faded. She's assaulting the checkout clerk, this and that. And, we kind of see it end there. But then they do this like postscript where they talk about how she's cleaned up her life and now she helps others and she's a chainsaw artist. Like, it's just like really random postscript. The postscript was just kind of a way to end it for me.
Yeah, I agree. Here's my note because I think that sums this up. The where did they go? Where are they now? Texas unneeded. This is not the Joan Jett and the Blackhearts or Cherie gets into chainsaw carving movie. I actually like the idea of doing a significant time jump. So you have Currie has her breakdown, leaves the band, and then have a nice big time jump, maybe decades, and have a nice scene where Currie is helping some recovering addicts. Here's Joan Jett on the radio and just says something like, I used to be in the band with her, kind of thing. It doesn't have to be the very stereotypical for this kind of movie. Here's where everybody wound up. Because, yeah, it didn't add anything. And it was kind of a letdown. It was like the movie just sort of said, well, I'm done.
Yeah, Cherie had her breakdown. Joan's on her way to fame and fortune. The end. And let me just add all the, but really, I mean, it's this amazing story of Cherie like finding herself again, healing, helping other addicts. That's very glossed over. It would have been nice to actually see a moment of that as older Cherie.
Do you think this movie would have benefited from even more focus on just one character? Just do everything through Curry's eyes. And that Joan is just another important but secondary character. And just really focus on building up Currie and what she went through and how she saw things.
Yes, because this is her memoirs. It's her story, and you don't have enough time on screen. If you're going to do that well, you don't have time on screen to really get into Joan Jett's story or or some of the other band characters. Like, it should be focused on Cherie's perspective, and things could be happening to the other band characters, like if they got into the rape of Jackie Fuchs, for example. But it's Cherie's perspective on that, right? And how that works with her in the film. I think that the film was trying to cram too many things in it instead of just focusing on your primary point of view
Right. And
character.
I agree. That is where you could take that aspect of Folly's character that wouldn't work in the movie we have. But if you hyper focus or if you have Cherie as your point of view character, well, yeah, you can even have that in there, but it doesn't have to be purely then the movie about that because it's really about how that impacts her and how she reacts to that. By having multiple point of view characters, I think that makes it more complex. Just complex as from a storytelling point of view and how you add something like that in. Okay. Now that we've rewritten the entire movie, what about the film that we got did you like the best?
Well, I'm going to pick the soundtrack. I mean, this is a movie about a band, and they did a great job with the music. Like Cherry Bomb, loved it. Hollywood, good song. You had at the beginning the Wild One by Susie Quattro, the David Bowie song. Good job with the music. It helped immerse you into the world in the 1970s and girls rock, glam rock back then. So, yeah, that's my favorite thing about this.
While I agree the soundtrack is amazing, um, I really enjoyed the cherry bomb scene. That look at the creative process, the way that was done, the way Joan and Kim play off each other. That was a great scene. The problem is that after that, the movie I think loses focus and gets a lot more trope driven. But that was my favorite part of the film. That was just a wonderful scene. So, what did you like the least?
So the sex scene between Cherie and Joan, um, it was so weirdly done. I mean, you had the potential in that scene to really show like a good sex scene between two women. And instead, what you ended up with was patchy camera work, this weird zooming in and out. It was disjointed. At one point, they had a red filter on it. There was strange close ups where they're like zooming in on Cherie's eye, I believe. It was just so weird. It's like they didn't want to go there and have a good lesbian sex scene, even though they want to hit you over the head with the fact that Joan Jett is bisexual. But then when it comes to having the girl on girl sex scene, like, you can't do it. You do this, like, there was no passion because the camera work didn't show it.
Yeah, I agree with you. That is not my least like thing, but that scene and just some of the camera work in general and some of the cinematography choices were mystifying. I'm not sure why they shot that scene the way they did. I thought, the use of some of the montage sequences so overdone and has no place in a semi true story. So, yeah, there are some camera issues. My biggest problem, though, was with the overuse of that all men are bad cliche. And it's a fine theme, and there's nothing wrong with having even all negative male characters in a story. I have no problem with that. The way it's done, though, is so inelegant, so ham fisted, that by the end, whatever point they thought they were making is lost in this sea of needlessly angry dudes. So, what would you say as far as your final rating?
So I gave this film a 3 out of 5. It's watchable, and it was an interesting autobiography that made me want to learn more about it. Like, I probably spent a good hour or so down the rabbit hole of just learning the real story behind the Runaways after the film. So it inspired me to learn more about the Runaways. I would overall recommend watching it for anyone that's interested in music, especially classic rock, and just the historical underpinnings of that, and likes period pieces, I think it's worth watching.
So I gave it 3.5 teen rock goddess pandas. I would rate this as a decent, fictionalized, true story. Worth watching, especially if you like the band.
Yeah, you'll have cherry bomb stuck in your head for a few days after watching this film.
There could be worse songs stuck in your head. Anyway, though, I think that's it for us.
Yeah, take care and rock on.
And thank you for listening to Stream On. Join us next week when we'll be reviewing Lady Bird, currently streaming on Netflix. Stream On is a production of Steph and Jeff Writes Media. Reproduction of this podcast without written consent is prohibited. All rights reserved. 2020.